14 of Europe's most powerful CEOs, men and women who control billions in African resources, sitting in complete silence, their hands trembling, their carefully rehearsed arguments crumbling, all because of 7 minutes and 23 seconds of words spoken by a 36-year-old soldier. What you're about to discover is how President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso delivered the most devastating corporate takedown in modern African history. No shouting, no threats, just cold, hard facts that sent shockwaves through boardrooms from Paris to Stockholm. But here's what makes this story truly explosive. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. The mahogany conference table at Ouagadougou's International Business Center had hosted countless meetings where European executives carved up African resources like a Sunday roast. Today, it would witness something unprecedented. The silence was suffocating. 14 titans of European industry sat frozen, their expensive translation devices suddenly useless. Everyone understood perfectly what had just occurred. Henrik Andersen, CEO of Nordgold Mining, would later confess to his board that in 40 years of African business, he'd never been more terrified by a speech containing 0 direct threats. But terror doesn't adequately describe what these executives experienced. It was the dawning realization that their world was about to collapse. Let me take you back 3 hours earlier when these same executives stepped out of their armored convoys, briefcases in hand, absolutely confident they were about to bend another African leader to their will. The European Business Council had orchestrated this meeting weeks in advance. Their strategy was simple: pressure the young military leader into maintaining the sweetheart deals they'd enjoyed for decades. After all, what choice did Burkina Faso really have? They needed European investment, European expertise, European money, or so these executives told themselves as their black SUVs carved through Ouagadougou's dusty streets that March morning. Markus Richter, CEO of Titan Resources, was practically giddy with confidence. During the ride, he'd joked to his colleague, "This won't take long. These African leaders always cave when you show them the numbers." He was already checking his phone, planning his evening flight to Paris, when something unexpected happened. The convoy stopped. But not at the presidential palace, not at the Ministry of Commerce. Instead, they found themselves staring at a modest community center in one of Ouagadougou's working-class neighborhoods. The confusion was immediate and unsettling. "There must be some mistake," declared Claudette Marron, representing 3 major French agricultural conglomerates. Her assistant frantically made phone calls, but the response was crystal clear. This was the correct location. President Traoré was waiting inside. As they entered the building, what they saw made their blood run cold. The room was packed not just with government officials, but with local miners, farmers, teachers, nurses, elderly women in traditional dress, and young people with smartphones ready to record everything. This wasn't a private negotiation. This was a public reckoning. And that's when they realized they'd walked into something far more dangerous than they'd imagined. President Traoré entered at exactly 10 o'clock. But instead of the suit they expected, he wore military fatigues. No ceremony, no protocol. He walked directly to a simple wooden podium that looked borrowed from the local school. The executives shifted nervously. Everything about this felt wrong. Where was the power display they were accustomed to? Where were the symbols of state authority they could respect and, more importantly, negotiate with? Instead, they faced a young soldier standing before his people. And the people were watching these foreign executives with eyes that held no deference, only curiosity about what would happen next. "Gentlemen, ladies," Traoré began in perfect French, his voice carrying without amplification, "thank you for accepting my invitation. I know you expected to meet under different circumstances, but I wanted you to speak to Burkina Faso. Not just to me. These people around you, they are Burkina Faso." The executives exchanged nervous glances. This was already completely off script. Anderson loosened his tie. The room felt uncomfortably warm, though perhaps it was something else making him sweat. Traoré continued, pulling out a single sheet of paper with the casualness of someone reading a grocery list. But what he read would detonate like a bomb in that quiet room. I have here the combined profits your 14 companies extracted from Burkina Faso last year, 17 billion euros. I also have the amount you paid in taxes, 300 million euros, and that's less than 2%. He paused, letting those numbers sink in like poison. But numbers are just numbers. Let me tell you what they mean. He gestured to an elderly woman in the front row. This is Mama Salamata. She worked in your gold mines for 30 years, Mr. Anderson. She earned 40 euros a month while extracting gold worth millions. Today, she can't afford medicine for the arthritis caused by conditions in your mines. Anderson wanted to protest, to explain about market rates and operational costs. But something in Traoré's eyes, a quiet steel that brooked no interruption, made him remain silent. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was something he hadn't encountered in 4 decades of doing business in Africa. Mr. Richter, Traoré continued, turning to the Titan Resources CEO, your company has been drilling for oil in our northern regions for 15 years. You've extracted 4 billion barrels. Do you know how many households in those regions have electricity? The silence stretched. 7%. 7% have light, while you pump billions of dollars worth of oil from beneath their feet. The room fell completely still. Even the young people with phones seemed to have forgotten they were recording. Richter felt his collar tightening. He wanted to argue about infrastructure challenges, about the complexities of development. But the faces around him, those ordinary Burkinabe faces, made his prepared arguments crumble in his throat. Madame Marron. Traoré's voice remained steady, almost gentle. Your agricultural companies control 60% of our arable land. You grow cotton for European fashion houses while Burkinabe children suffer malnutrition. Last year, you exported cotton worth 2 billion euros. The farmers who grow it earned less than $1 a day. Marron opened her mouth, then closed it. The elderly women in traditional dress were staring at her not with anger, but with a kind of patient waiting, as if they'd been waiting decades to hear what she might say. She found she had nothing. Now, Traoré said, and his voice took on a different quality. Still calm, but with an edge of steel that made everyone lean forward. I could seize your assets. I could nationalize your operations. Many of my advisors have urged me to do exactly that. It would be legal under international law given the unconscionable terms of your contracts. The relief in the room from the executive side was palpable, but it was short-lived. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, Traoré continued with the patience of a teacher explaining a simple concept to slow students. I'm going to give you a choice. You can stay in Burkina Faso, but under new terms. 51% local ownership. Minimum wage of 300 euros per month for all workers. 30% of profits reinvested in local infrastructure. Environmental restoration funds managed by local communities. Full transparency in all financial dealings with records public and accessible. He paused, looking at each executive in turn. Or you can leave. The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched on until finally Jonathan Pierce, CEO of Meridian Extraction, found his voice. This is impossible. These terms would make our operations unprofitable. Our shareholders would never accept this. Traoré nodded slowly, as if Pierce had just confirmed something he'd suspected all along. I understand. Your shareholders' profits matter more than Burkinabe lives. That's been clear for decades. So leave. The simplicity of it was stunning. No anger, no drama. Just a statement of fact delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. But you need us, stammered Wilhelm Krauss from Continental Mining Corporation, desperation creeping into his voice. Our technology, our expertise, our connections to global markets. Without us, your economy will collapse." And that's when Traoré smiled for the first time during the entire meeting. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Mr. Kraus, that's what you've told us for 60 years, that we need you more than you need us. But let me share something with you." He pulled out his phone and connected it to a small projector. The image that appeared was a map of Africa with various points highlighted in green. "As of this morning, I have agreements with 7 African nations for technical cooperation. Our combined engineering graduates number over 1 million. We have partnerships with universities in China, India, and Russia for technology transfer. We have investment funds from the Middle East ready to replace every euro you take out." He gestured to the young people in the room, their phones now recording again, their eyes bright with something that looked dangerously like hope. "But more importantly, we have them. This generation that refuses to accept that Africa's role is to make others rich while remaining poor ourselves." David Blond, representing 3 Swedish telecommunications companies, tried a different approach, the reasonable negotiator. "President Traoré, surely we can negotiate these terms you're proposing. They're just an opening position, right?" "Everything is negotiable." Traoré shook his head slowly, and for the first time there was something almost like pity in his expression. "No, Mr. Blond, that's your way, not ours. Negotiation assumes both parties have something the other needs. But we don't need you. We have what you need: our resources, our land, our labor. You have nothing we cannot obtain elsewhere under fair terms." The fear in the room was now palpable among the executives. This wasn't going according to any playbook they knew. They'd dealt with African leaders before, many of them. There was always an angle, always a deal to be made, always a way to maintain their advantages. But this young soldier wasn't playing their game. He wasn't even acknowledging their game existed. "You have 72 hours to decide," Traoré announced, beginning to wrap up. "Stay under our terms or leave with what you can carry. Any assets left behind will be considered abandoned and will revert to the Burkina Faso people." "This is theft," burst out Alessandro Romano, CEO of Apex Industries, finally losing his composure. "We have contracts, legal agreements. We'll go to international courts." The room tensed, waiting for Traoré's response. But instead of anger, his face showed something almost like pity. "Mr. Romano, those contracts were signed with governments that didn't represent their people. Contracts signed under coercion, corruption, and colonial pressure have no moral validity. As for international courts," he shrugged with magnificent indifference, "go ahead. While you spend years in litigation, we'll be building our country with partners who respect us." The meeting was clearly ending, but Traoré had one more thing to say, words that would be quoted in newspapers around the world within hours. "Before you leave, I want you to understand something. This isn't about hatred. We don't hate you. This is about justice. For too long, Africa has been a plantation, and you've been the overseers. That era ends today, here in Burkina Faso. You can be part of Africa's future as partners, real partners, or you can be part of its past. The choice is yours." As the executives filed out, their faces pale and drawn, they passed through crowds that had gathered outside. Thousands of Burkina Faso had come, not to protest, but simply to witness. They stood in silence, watching these powerful men and women walk to their cars, no anger, no celebration. Just the quiet dignity of people who had finally heard someone speak their truth to power. Inside the cars, panic was setting in like a virus. Phones were ringing constantly. Emergency board meetings were being called. Stock prices were already beginning to fluctuate as news of the meeting leaked out through social media. Henrik Anderson was on his 3rd panicked call to Stockholm when his assistant showed him something on a tablet that made his blood freeze. It was a live stream from the meeting, already viewed 2 million times. The comments were flooding in from across Africa, across the world. Finally, this is what leadership looks like. Burkina Faso leads, Others will follow. The awakening has begun. He realized with a chill that cut deeper than any African winter that this wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. If Traoré succeeded here, if he actually forced them out or made them accept these terms, every African nation would demand the same. 14 companies representing combined revenues of over 30 billion euros had 72 hours to make a decision that would reshape the economic landscape of an entire continent. By that evening, the expatriate community in Ouagadougou was in complete chaos. The Cercle France, the exclusive club where European business executives had gathered for decades to divide African resources over fine wine, was packed with emergency meetings that resembled war councils more than business discussions. Marcus Richter stood before a hastily assembled group, trying to project calm while his hands shook. "We need to stand together. If we all refuse, he'll have to back down. The economic shock would be too great for them to handle." But Claudette Marron shook her head, her usual composure completely shattered. "You didn't see his eyes, Marcus. He's not bluffing. He'd rather see the economy crash and rebuild from scratch than continue under the current terms." "Then we fight," insisted Romano, his face flushed with rage and expensive whiskey. "We have contracts, international law, the World Bank, the IMF. We have leverage." Jonathan Pierce laughed bitterly. "What leverage? Did you see it? The people in that room. They're ready for whatever comes. And those partnership agreements he mentioned? They're real. I've already had calls from 3 Chinese companies ready to take over our operations the moment we leave." The room erupted in arguments. Some wanted to fight, others to negotiate. Still others were already planning their withdrawal, quietly instructing their assistants to book flights and liquidate what assets they could. Meanwhile, in a modest office across the city, Traoré sat with his economic advisors. They were nervous but determined, like soldiers before a battle they knew was righteous but uncertain. "The markets will react badly," warned his finance minister Patricia Ouedraogo. "Our currency could crash. International credit ratings will plummet." Traoré nodded calmly. "I know, but what's the alternative? Another 60 years of being Europe's gas station and mine? Our people deserve better, even if the path is difficult." Colonel Amadou Sawadago, his security advisor, had other concerns that kept him awake at night. "They'll try to destabilize us, fund opposition groups, maybe even attempt a coup." Traoré's response was as steady as granite. "Let them try. The people are with us. You saw them today. They're ready for this fight." As the 72 hours ticked by with the relentlessness of a countdown to doomsday, the drama intensified. 3 companies immediately announced they would leave, triggering panic selling of their stocks that wiped out billions in market value. 4 others tried desperately to negotiate, sending teams of lawyers and consultants like medieval envoys seeking audience with a king. But Traoré refused to meet them. "The terms are set," was his only response, delivered through intermediaries with the finality of carved stone. The French government got involved, with President Macron himself calling Traoré. The conversation, which leaked later through diplomatic channels, was tense and revealed the depth of European panic. "You're making a mistake," Macron warned, his diplomatic mask slipping. "France has been Burkina Faso's partner for decades." Traoré's response was polite but firm as steel. "We're looking for partners, not masters." President Macron. The European Union threatened sanctions. The World Bank warned of dire consequences. The IMF spoke ominously of economic isolation. But something unexpected happened that caught everyone off guard. Other African nations began to speak up like lions finding their roar. Mali announced it was reviewing all foreign mining contracts. Niger suspended 3 uranium extraction licenses. Ghana began an audit of foreign-owned agricultural operations that had been extracting wealth for generations. On social media, Burkina Stands Up became a global trending topic, shared millions of times across every platform. Videos of Traoré's speech, subtitled in dozens of languages, went viral faster than any corporate marketing campaign. Young Africans across the continent shared stories of exploitation by foreign corporations that read like a catalog of modern colonialism. Economists debated whether Traoré's model could work. Some called it economic suicide. Others called it long overdue decolonization. The world was watching, and the old assumptions were crumbling. The 72 hours were almost up when the first crack appeared in European solidarity. Surprisingly, it came from Wilhelm Krauss of Continental Mining, the same man who had insisted Burkina Faso needed European expertise to survive. In a private meeting with his board that would later leak, he had argued with the passion of a convert. "We can accept these terms and still be profitable. Less profitable, yes, but profitable. And if we're the first to agree, we'll have an advantage when other countries inevitably follow suit." His board was skeptical, but Krauss had done the math with the precision of a man whose career depended on being right. Even with 51% local ownership and higher wages, the operation would still generate hundreds of millions in profit. More importantly, being first to accept would position them as progressive partners in Africa's development rather than exploiters fleeing a sinking ship. It could open doors across the continent. At hour 68, Continental Mining announced it would accept Traoré's terms. The shock in the European business community was profound, like watching their own soldiers defect to the enemy. "Traitor!" Romano shouted at Krauss during a heated phone call that half of Ouagadougou could hear through the hotel walls. But Krauss was unmoved, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had seen the future and adapted to it. "I'm a businessman, Alessandro. I see which way the wind is blowing. Do you?" The domino effect was immediate and devastating to European unity. 2 more companies announced they would stay under the new terms. Others began frantically trying to negotiate modifications, their previous arrogance replaced by desperate pragmatism. But for most, pride, shareholder pressure, and sheer inability to adapt to a new reality where they weren't the masters led to only one choice. By the deadline, 11 of the 14 companies announced they were withdrawing from Burkina Faso. The headlines around the world were dramatic enough to make Hollywood producers jealous. European exodus from Burkina Faso. Traoré's gamble, economic liberation or suicide. The 7-minute speech that shook Africa. The departing executives held a press conference at the airport, a last desperate attempt to control the narrative and save face before their shareholders. "This is a dark day for Burkina Faso," Anderson declared, his voice carrying less conviction than he intended. "They've chosen ideology over prosperity." But even as he spoke, his phone was buzzing with messages from shareholders, furious about abandoned assets and lost profits that would haunt quarterly reports for years. The 3 companies that stayed found themselves in an unexpected position that none of them had anticipated. Jonathan Pierce of Meridian Extraction, who had initially resisted but finally accepted the terms, told his board with surprising optimism, "We're now the senior Western partners in what might become Africa's most important economic experiment. If this works, and I'm beginning to think it might, we'll be positioned perfectly for the new Africa." The immediate aftermath was indeed chaotic, like the first days after any revolution. The Burkinabe franc lost 20% of its value in 3 days. International credit agencies downgraded the country's rating with the speed of vultures circling carrion. Some foreign aid was suspended as punishment for their audacity. But something else happened, too, something the economists hadn't predicted. Remittances from the Burkinabe diaspora increased by 300% in a month as people around the world sent money to support their homeland's bold stand. Several Middle Eastern investment funds announced major infrastructure projects. A consortium of Indian technology companies proposed a digital transformation initiative that dwarfed anything the Europeans had ever offered. And, most surprisingly, applications to Burkina Faso's universities from across Africa increased by 500%, as young people wanted to study in the country that had shown them what was possible. 3 months later, when the dust had settled and the initial panic had subsided, the picture was complex but not the disaster many had predicted. Unemployment had initially spiked as operations closed, but was beginning to fall as local companies took over abandoned facilities. The economy had contracted but was showing signs of stabilization that surprised even optimistic projections. Most importantly, something intangible but powerful had emerged, a sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. In an interview with Al Jazeera that was watched across Africa, Traoré reflected on those 7 minutes with the wisdom of someone who had changed history. "I didn't plan to change everything with that speech. I simply told the truth about exploitation, about dignity, about our right to determine our own future. It turns out that's all our people needed to hear." The 14 European companies that had dominated Burkina Faso's economy for decades were reduced to 3, operating under terms that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. But perhaps the most significant change wasn't in Burkina Faso at all. It was in boardrooms across Europe, where executives dealing with Africa now had a new calculation to make. The era of easy exploitation was ending, and everyone knew it. A 7-minute speech had made that crystal clear. 1 year later, economists would call it the Ouagadougou precedent. 5 African nations had implemented similar policies. Foreign corporations were adapting, some willingly, others reluctantly, to a new reality where African resources came with African terms. The world hadn't ended. The sky hadn't fallen. But something fundamental had shifted in the global balance of power. In the community center in Ouagadougou, where it all began, a plaque was installed. It simply read, "Here, on March 15, 2024, President Ibrahim Traoré spoke for 7 minutes and 23 seconds. Africa listened. The world changed." The 14 CEOs who sat in that room would never forget those 7 minutes. Some, like Anderson, would spend years fighting legal battles trying to recover assets, becoming cautionary tales in business schools. Others, like Krauss, would build new business models based on genuine partnership and find unexpected success. But all of them knew they had witnessed a historic moment. The moment when one man's quiet words ended an era of exploitation that had seemed as eternal as the African sun. 7 minutes. That's all it took. 7 minutes of truth spoken calmly in a modest room, witnessed by ordinary people who had waited generations to hear someone say what Ibrahim Traoré said that day. Not with anger or hatred, but with the simple dignity of stating facts that everyone knew but no one in power had ever acknowledged. Today, business schools study those 7 minutes as a masterclass in negotiation through moral authority. Political scientists analyze it as a turning point in post-colonial economics. But for the people who were in that room, it was simpler than that. It was the day someone finally said what needed to be said, and in saying it, changed everything. The most ironic twist came 6 months later, like a final act in a play about human nature and power. Henrik Andersen, the same CEO who had fled Burkina Faso in panic, was caught in a hidden camera investigation by Swedish journalists. In what he thought was a private dinner conversation, he was heard saying words that would haunt him forever. "Traoré was right, you know. We were parasites. For 40 years, we took everything and gave nothing back. Maybe it's better this way." The video went viral, with millions of views across Africa alone, shared with the joy of vindication. Anderson was forced to resign within days, but his admission became an unexpected validation of everything Traoré had said. Meanwhile, the 3 companies that stayed were reporting something remarkable to their shareholders, something that challenged every assumption about African business. Employee productivity had increased by 200%. Theft and sabotage, once common problems that had cost millions annually, had virtually disappeared. Local communities were protecting company infrastructure as if it were their own. Jonathan Pierce of Meridian Extraction told the Financial Times in an interview that became required reading in business schools. When people feel they are partners, not servants, everything changes. We should have learned this decades ago. The final vindication came from an unexpected source that surprised even Traoré's supporters. The World Bank's annual report, 18 months after the famous speech, included a special section on what they carefully termed the Burkina Faso model. The report admitted, in the carefully diplomatic language that international institutions use when admitting they were wrong, that traditional development approaches may have inadvertently perpetuated dependency rather than fostering genuine economic growth. It was the closest the institution had ever come to admitting that Traoré had been right all along. In Ouagadougou, life continued with a new rhythm. The community center where those 7 minutes of history were spoken became a pilgrimage site of sorts. Young entrepreneurs would stand where Traoré stood, drawing inspiration from the floorboards. Students would sit where the CEOs sat, imagining the fear and confusion of those who had thought themselves masters of the universe. And sometimes, late in the evening when the crowds had gone home, Mama Salamata would come by. The elderly woman Traoré had pointed out during his speech. She would tell anyone who would listen, her voice carrying the weight of lived experience. I worked 30 years for them and got nothing but pain in my bones. That day, my president spoke for 7 minutes and gave me back my dignity. That's worth more than all the gold they ever took from our earth. Those words, spoken by an elderly woman in a simple dress, captured something that all the economic analyses and political commentary couldn't touch. In 7 minutes, Ibrahim Traoré hadn't just changed trade terms or renegotiated contracts. He had given a people back their pride, and that, perhaps, was worth more than all the billions that had been extracted from African soil over the decades of exploitation. The revolution had begun with 7 minutes of truth. What came next would reshape not just Burkina Faso, not just Africa, but the entire relationship between the developed and developing world. Because once people remember their worth, they never forget it.